Hi everyone, my name is Kendra Smith and I will be reviewing the court case of Board of Education of the Hendrick Hudson Central School District of Westchester County versus Rowley by her parents. This court case is also known as Board of Education v. Rowley, and this case was reviewed by the Supreme Court of the United States and was argued on March 23rd of 1982 and was decided on June 28th of 1982. So this court case regards FAPE, which is free and appropriate public education, and even more so than that, the heart of the case has to do with statutory interpretation. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a little background information on this case. So Amy Rowley was a deaf student at the Furnace Woods School in the Hendrick Hudson Central School District in Peekskill, New York. Now Amy has some residual hearing, but she is an excellent lip reader. So a year before attending Furnace Woods School, a meeting was held between Amy's parents, who are also deaf, and the school administration. And in this meeting, they made the decision to place Amy in a general education kindergarten classroom and provide her with supplemental services to better fit her educational needs. So before Amy began attending the school, several members of the school administration took sign language courses, and a teletype machine was also placed in the principal's office so that the school could communicate with Amy's parents. So at this meeting, they also decided that Amy would be given a trial period of kindergarten, basically. So Amy was given 2 weeks, and at the conclusion of this 2 weeks, it was decided that Amy should remain in the general education kindergarten classroom full-time. So they also decided that it would be best if Amy would be given an FM hearing aid. So an FM hearing aid amplifies the words that are spoken into a wireless receiver. So Amy has headphones in her ears, and then a teacher or peer speaks into the wireless receiver, and Amy hears the words amplified in her ear. So with the aid of these supplemental services, Amy completed her kindergarten year. So when Amy moved into first grade, an IEP was written for her during the fall. So Amy's IEP stated that she should be educated in a regular education classroom at Furnace Woods. She should continue to use the FM hearing aid, and she should receive instruction from a tutor for the deaf for 1 hour each day, and from a speech therapist for 3 hours each week. So Amy's parents, the Rowleys, agreed with most aspects of Amy's IEP, but they insisted that Amy also be provided a qualified sign language interpreter in all her educational classes, instead of having the assistance being provided to her as stated in other parts of her IEP. So I want you guys to keep in mind that a sign language interpreter was placed in Amy's kindergarten class for a 2-week period, but the interpreter was deemed unnecessary at the time. So when the Rowleys made this proposal, the school district consulted the district's Committee on the Handicapped, and then the committee spoke to Amy's parents, Amy's teachers, and other individuals familiar with Amy's academic and social progress. And after doing so, the district decided to deny the Rowleys' request for an interpreter. So this led the Rowleys to demand a hearing with an independent examiner. So the examiner listened to evidence from both sides, being the school district and Amy's parents, and they ended up agreeing with the school district that an interpreter was not necessary because, quote, Amy was achieving educationally, academically, and socially without such assistance. So after the independent examiner denied the request for an interpreter, the Rowleys brought an action in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. And the Rowleys made the claim that the denial of an interpreter was a denial of FAPE. And they also made the claim that Amy was not discrepant in her or from her peers, but was discrepant from her full potential that she would have if she did not have her handicap. So then the district court found that Amy was remarkably well adjusted and performed better than the average child in her class, and she was easily advancing from grade level to grade level. But she, quote, understands considerably less of what goes on in class than she could if she were not deaf. So, and therefore, she was not learning as much or performing as well academically as she would without her handicap. So then because of this, the court decided that Amy was not receiving a free and appropriate public education, and the court then defined an appropriate education as an opportunity to achieve full potential commensurate with the opportunity provided to other children. So then, after the case was at the district court level, a panel of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit affirmed and agreed with the district court's conclusion. So then, at this time, the Board of Education requested that the case be seen by a higher court. So the case then went to the United States Supreme Court, and they had to consider what is meant by the Act's requirement of a free, appropriate public education. So now when I say Act, I'm referring to the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, which includes FAPE and the FAPE regulations. So this was the first case in which the Supreme Court had been called to interpret the Act. And as the District Court and the Court of Appeals had concluded, the Act itself does not define appropriate education, but leaves to the courts and the hearing officers the responsibility of determining the content of appropriate education. So then, under the Act, the term free and appropriate public education means special education and related services which A, have been provided at public expense under public supervision and direction and without charge, B, meet the standards of the state educational agency, C, include an appropriate preschool, elementary, or secondary school education in the state involved, and D, are provided in conformity with the individualized education program required under Section 1414 of this title. So after discussing this definition, the court concluded that according to the definition contained in the Act, a free, appropriate public education consists of educational instruction specially designed to meet the unique needs of the handicapped. So therefore, if personalized instruction is being provided with sufficient supportive services to permit the child to benefit from the instruction, and the other items on the definitional checklist are satisfied, then the child is receiving a free, appropriate public education as defined by the Act. So then the court decided that there are two main questions when determining what appropriate education is. So the first question is, has the state complied with the procedures set forth in the Act? And number two, is the IEP developed through the Act's procedures reasonably calculated to enable the child to receive educational benefits? So then if these two requirements are met, then the state has complied with the obligations of the Act and the courts can require no more. So these two questions have become known as the Rowley standard, and courts still use these questions today when determining appropriate education. So then looking at these two requirements, the Supreme Court concluded that the Court of Appeals and the District Court erred. So neither of the courts had found that the petitioners had failed to comply with the procedures of the Act, thus meaning that there was no evidence supporting that Amy's educational program was failing. So instead, they had found that Amy was receiving an adequate education since she was performing better than the average peer in her class, and she was advancing from grade to grade effortlessly. So then, because of this, the Supreme Court reversed the Court of Appeals decision, and the court ordered that Amy Rowley remain in the first grade with all the previous supplemental supports and services offered by the school district, and there would be no sign of a language interpreter. So overall, the court ruled that Amy's IEP was acceptable, and she was not being denied an appropriate education, but instead was receiving a free, appropriate public education. So one of the main takeaways for us is that the word appropriate can be applied in many ways. So the issue becomes, what does the word appropriate mean when it is used to modify education? So because parents can challenge IEPs, we will always deal with the issues of courts being called upon to review the contents of the IEP and then make a judgment based on the evidence that's provided about whether or not the education the child is receiving is appropriate. So if we have a case that goes to the courts, then the court is going to be left to make the decision about what appropriate means. So after reviewing this case, I thought about what are some of the implications for us as educators. So I think it's most important for us as educators to always put the students' best interest at the forefront of any decisions we make. We always need to be thinking about, is this decision going to provide the student with an appropriate education? Are we doing what we need to do in order to best help the student? And then we also need to communicate with parents and engage them. So we need to make sure parents know what is going on with their child so we can work with the parents in order to make the best choices for that child. So our job the entire time revolves around, are we making the best decisions for this child? Are we making sure they are receiving the education that they need to receive? And then one of the most important points for us as special educators especially is when it comes to writing our students' IEPs. So we need to make sure we're individualizing each and every student's IEP. If I have a group of students who are deaf, I'm not going to use a template of an IEP that is just fit for a deaf student. I'm going to look at each and every one of those students and individualize the IEP to make sure that it best suits that student. We cannot use or form a mold for those students. That is the conclusion of my case review on Board of Education v. Rowley, and I will have your questions posted in my discussion. Thank you.